It's good to see you all today. You have entered the Zoom where we're going to be talking about multisensory foundational skills instruction. So welcome to all of you. What we're going to do while we wait for just a few minutes is we would love for you to go ahead and drop the following in the chat, your name, your role, any grade levels you support, and where are you? Where in the world are you? And we'll go ahead and get started in maybe 1 or 2 minutes, making sure that we have everyone in the room. Later in the San Diego County Office of Ed, I'm one of 3 county offices that make up the Project Arise team, which we'll chat about in just a few minutes. Project Arise is a statewide funded professional development grant, and really the focus is to empower educators to elevate their literacy instruction for every learner, making it as inclusive and effective as possible using research-based practices. And as you can see, we have quite a number of partners in this work, all the way up and down the state of California. Today we have TNTP joining us today. And we are going to chat just a little bit about our online free self-paced courses that you can access at any point. It's really exciting because these courses, you can go through them at your own pace, and graduate units are available for you too, as well. So we encourage you to take a look at them. Some of the topics include executive functions, literacy as equity, foundational skills. There's comprehension and knowledge building, which will support students in understanding what they're reading, as well as intensive intervention. We have several learning opportunities, but as our grant comes to an end this March, we will be closing up our official running of the live workshops, but we will give access to everyone with all the resources that we have available, and we'll talk a little bit more about how to access those.
All right, thank you, Melanie, and thanks, Nicole. For those of y'all that haven't met me before, I'm Ruthie Woolfolk. I work for TNTP, and I've been supporting with the Project Arise virtual PLC sessions throughout kind of the winter. And so I'm really excited to be here today. I just dropped a link in the chat for a session resource that you can reference today if you like to take notes in a digital resource. So that's in the chat for you. It will kind of force you to make a copy for your own device so you can take notes there. There will also be a couple places throughout today's session that I will invite you to do some reflection or just to kind of jot some notes down, so you could do that there, but you can also feel free to use a different note-taking system if you have one that you prefer instead. So we just wanted to provide that in case that's helpful. So we will go ahead and kind of get into our agenda today. We will first just kind of give a quick explanation of the purpose of this series, which is, like Melanie referenced, with the general Project Arise work, really bringing together research and practice so that we can talk about equitable literacy access and outcomes for all students. But particularly today, and in this series in general, we're really focusing in on supports for students with disabilities and multilingual learners, and making sure that we're providing the supports and resources and strategies that they would need to make sure that they're striving toward the same kind of literacy outcomes that we're working for all learners. So for today's work, we're going to really lean into that belief that all students can learn and are capable of achieving grade level standards with multiple opportunities and timely support and practice. And so what our goals are for today is really making sure that we're equipping you with strategies to support all learners, including, like I said, multilingual learners and students with disabilities. In particular, today we're going to focus on multisensory work and ways that in the foundational skills lessons that you're delivering, you can really use those multisensory strategies to support students. So we're going to, in that work, kind of support you to identify a particular strategy or support that might enhance your practice, or it might be something that you're already doing, and it might be something that you can leave here affirmed, knowing that's really important for you to keep doing. And one way that you're really supporting students with disabilities or students who are multilingual learners, or kind of just students who might be struggling to read for a variety of reasons in your classroom. So that might be an outcome of today's, you leave feeling really affirmed that you're doing kind of the right strategies and supports for those students. So I'll give you a moment to take a look at our agenda, and then we'll kind of get into our work for today. All right, so we're going to start with a little bit of background on what multisensory instruction is, because sometimes terms like this can get thrown around and redefined or kind of mean a lot of different things. So we're going to define it in specific ways for this session. And we're going to talk a little bit about why those are important before we get into some examples of those strategies in your classroom instruction. So in terms of what multisensory instruction is, it's really working towards strategies that directly involve students in seeing, hearing, saying, and writing during instruction. So the gist here is that, these are any strategies that involve multiple senses happening simultaneously for students. So the underlying idea is by activating those sensory pathways, students are better able to encode what they're trying to encode or retain or retrieve information in their brain. This particularly matters for learners with diverse backgrounds or diverse learning needs. So the Center for Dyslexia Research has found that multisensory instruction is particularly beneficial for students with dyslexia because it helps to reinforce learning through various channels in their brain. So it compensates for, in some cases for students with dyslexia, specific deficits that they might be having in areas of processing in their brain, and it helps them kind of reinforce those pathways in a lot of different other parts of their brain, and in a lot of ways compensate for those deficits. So if you've ever been involved in training for students with dyslexia, or even training for students who are multilingual learners or dual language students, you're probably very familiar with some of the strategies that we'll talk about today because they're really common, especially in dual language, bilingual work, as ways to support students in language acquisition. And in that setting, multisensory strategies have also been shown to increase engagement for students or to support deep understanding for all learners, including English learners, and also for students who are struggling to read for whatever reason. So all of that is to really say these strategies, again, might be familiar to you, and we are excited that that's true. We're excited that we're, affirming things that you might be already including in your practice. They might be new, but when used correctly and strategically, they can really support a diverse range of students, both in their attention and engagement when they're reading and their processing ability, but also in storing things in their memory. And so moving things into long-term memory when they have enough repetition. So they can be really, really powerful strategies. I also want to just give a quick note, and this is part of why we're kind of establishing common definitions here. Sometimes you'll hear the phrase multimodal instruction when they talk about multisensory learning. So those are often used interchangeably. And so if you've heard multimodal instruction, again, I want you to just feel affirmed that both support kind of this idea that we're using more than one path to present or share information for students so that they can kind of tap into multiple brain pathways and deepen those connections. So there are 6 principles of multisensory instruction that we really want to live by when we're working in our classroom practices. The first one is that instruction simultaneously engages multiple senses. This really promotes stronger memory and neural connections. And like we talked about before, studies with students with dyslexia have shown significant benefits to instruction that combine visual, auditory, tactile activities. And that really supports students in retaining information in stronger ways. And that can lead to better comprehension outcomes, better fluency outcomes for those students. So we really want to be tapping into lots and lots of ways that students are, again, hearing, saying, reading, and writing what they're working on. Second, multisensory strategies are intentionally integrated into this explicit and systematic instruction that you're already engaging in your foundational skills. So the context that we're using multisensory work is really important. These strategies won't work just in isolation or on their own. They still need to be integrated into research-aligned practices that show us how students best learn how to read, i.e. the science of reading. So really making sure, particularly as students are learning to decode, that we're being really explicit and systematic in that instruction, and we're providing them ways to hear, see, and write different words that we're practicing. That kind of leads us into our third principle, which is repetition is really, really critical for supporting students in building that long-term memory. And so repetition reinforces learning so that students are practicing skills across many concepts and ultimately that they're able to generalize those skills. This is particularly true for students with disabilities who might need more time to practice new concepts. This can really support their retrieval if they're practicing it many, many times, even across multiple settings in their day. And this can also just kind of enhance student confidence and ultimately kind of enhance student performance and motivation when they feel like, oh, I know how to be successful in this because I did it with this teacher and I did it with this teacher. And so providing that repetition and providing that opportunity to generalize skills can be really powerful for students. The fourth principle is that multisensory instruction typically involves an intentional sequence that supports learning from going from more simple to more complex tasks. So this connects to that piece about systematic instruction. Again, we really want to ensure that skills kind of build on one another. That really helps students, especially students who might be struggling, to reduce kind of their cognitive overload when they're learning a particular skill or when they're practicing a particular skill. And so if we move from kind of more simple to more complex skills, they have that opportunity to kind of build that confidence again, and sort of just that automaticity in their brain pathways before they move to something a little bit more complex. The fifth principle is that we really want multisensory instruction to encourage active participation. So we talked in our definition about how multisensory instruction can really engage learners and kind of activate their brain pathways. To do that well, we really want them to be actively involved in the instruction. So we don't want them to be kind of passively hearing something or passively just kind of watching someone else read. We want them to really be actively involved in hearing something and then saying something, reading something and then writing something. We want to incorporate as much visual or tactile kind of multisensory work in that so that they're really engaged and actively involved. And then finally, multisensory instruction may be adapted to meet individual needs. So this kind of gets at, we want to provide flexibility in instruction, and we might notice that some students with particular multisensory strategies really latch on to particular skills. And so we want to keep kind of engaging them in that way. And then for other students, we might notice, oh, this particular visual or tactile support helps in a different way. And so having that kind of flexibility or adaptation for specific learning needs can be important to kind of keep top of mind. So with those principles, what we're going to do now is we're going to look at an example of what this would look like in the classroom. So I'm going to talk through kind of a sequence of instructional foundational skills transcripts that we might observe in a classroom. And as I do, I want you to be thinking about this focus question that you see at the bottom. So where do you see the multisensory strategies kind of present in this learning sequence, or how do you notice the principles of multisensory instruction that we just talked through present in this learning sequence? So I'm going to show you the example. And as I'm doing that, just kind of be thinking about that in your head. After I show the example, we'll invite you to share some thoughts in the chat so that we can kind of gauge some group consensus and ideas about this. So in this foundational skills classroom, we might observe the teacher says, cut. The students repeat in unison to say, cut. The teacher has students segment, up. And then finally, students write CUP on lined paper that they're working on. After they've written the CUP on their lined paper, then they read up, cup. So thinking about that sequence, where are the principles that we just talked about showing up in that sequence, or what multisensory strategies do you notice in this learning sequence? So I'll mute myself and invite you to share in the chat some ideas or thoughts that you're having about this classroom example. We're getting multisensory by getting to hear, say, write, read the word together. Simple to more complex. So we're going from speaking to much more complex with having students actually encode or write the word. Great. I'm gonna quickly stop sharing and then reshare for just a second. Sorry about that. Okay, great. So we noticed, like a lot of you were sharing in the chat, lots of different ways that students are hearing, saying, reading, writing. We're going from simple to more complex. We also noticed that these strategies probably look very familiar to a lot of you. The work is really focused on CVC words and the short U skill in this particular example. But what we're doing is intentionally sequencing learning so that students are engaging multiple senses as they practice that particular skill. And in some cases, this is incredibly supportive for all students. But some students may even benefit from more practice than this. And so there might be some adaptations if students need more support where we extend the practice to a couple of other examples like bus or run or something like that. Or we might include, again, some different adaptations to the tactile supports for individual students where we have Alconin boxes where they can kind of slide chips to segment that word before they try to write something. Things like that can kind of individualize or kind of be flexible in terms of accomplishing the same goals. All right, so what we're going to do now is think about one misconception that might be coming up for you is using multisensory strategies or using multimodal modal strategies, as they're sometimes called, should not be confused with learning styles. So there is, like, in some cases, students do have learning preferences where they might like really respond to auditory kind of supports or visual supports or things like that. But research has found that teaching to learning styles actually can really limit how we instruct and how we engage students. And in some cases, it can lead to lowered expectations or ineffective practices. So, although, again, students might have kind of preferences in terms of where they gravitate to or how they engage, research doesn't really support designing instruction to try to match that individual student's learning style. And in early literacy, this can be especially kind of harmful because it often deprives students of instruction outside of their kind of quote unquote perceived learning style. I hope, honestly, that this takes a little bit of pressure off of you as teachers, because it doesn't mean you don't need to like test or know or memorize any student's individual learning style. Instead, I want you to really think about how can we give all students opportunities across lots of different modalities within our lessons. So hearing, saying, reading, writing, how can we just kind of constantly integrate those opportunities for visual, tactile, kinesthetic movement, auditory supports, rather than kind of trying to tailor for every single student in your classroom. This student needs auditory, this student needs visual, and so on. So I'm hoping that that kind of takes a little bit of the pressure off of you as a teacher. The other thing that I want to connect to that idea that might take the pressure off is multimodal strategies are likely already a part of your instruction. So we can use multimodal strategies across the pillars of literacy that you see here on the left, with today's focus, especially with kind of those foundational skills, K-8, and phonemic awareness and phonics and fluency work and vocabulary work and comprehension and so on. We can use the multimodal strategies to kind of support learners in all of those pillars that you're already using. Many of your literacy programs and even the intervention programs that you're using have embedded multimodal strategies into the lessons or into instruction. And so as teachers, sometimes our role is, instead of having to come up with multimodal strategies on our own, we might be selecting which of these multimodal strategies are most important, or which of these are going to match to the purpose that we're working on, but will engage my students effectively. And importantly, like, we want to be using them with intentionality and then reflecting on how did that go when I used Alcone and boxes, for example, to engage students. Did that actually get kind of a different impact for students and their learning versus when I use some kind of movement? And so in just a moment, we'll look at some examples of multimodal instruction across different pillars of literacy. But I want you to kind of be thinking about these that you see on the right as well. We'll talk about some specific examples in today's session, but in general, you're probably noticing these things in your literacy instruction already, where you're engaging students in repeated readings, or you might be using total physical response where you're having kids stand up and sit down, or you're having kids use kinesthetic movement in some way. You might be using graphic organizers really intentionally. And so likely you're already doing many of these things. And so today's work is really just about refining that to be extremely intentional in selecting those multisensory strategies for your students, and then reflecting on, is that getting a different student outcome? Is that engaging students in a different way? What's the impact of those strategies that I'm working with? So with that, I'm going to give you a moment to do some individual reflection. So you can feel free to take notes on the handout that I shared at the beginning, or just kind of think to yourself or jot on a piece of paper with a pen. But I want you to just think about the section that we just worked through what affirms work that you've already done to support, especially the multilingual learners that are in your class or students with disabilities that you might be working with? Or is there something new or different that we've talked about so far that you're really thinking about? So I'll give you a moment to reflect, and then we'll move into some of the specific strategies in foundational skills work that we can use. To some of our specific strategies. So we're going to start with a lower elementary kind of strand of strategies in the phonemic awareness and phonics realm before we talk about some strategies that you could use for older students with some fluency work. So I want to just give a quick kind of plug. If you have taken the Project Arise modules, these terms are going to be incredibly familiar. If you haven't, but you want to learn more about them, that would be a great starting point to know more about phonemic awareness and phonics. But just to kind of give a quick overview, phonemic awareness comes within a larger umbrella term, phonological awareness. And that really references oral language skills, but in particular, the ability to hear, discriminate, and manipulate the English language and manipulate sounds within the words that students are working with in English. So things like identifying rhyming words, things like segmenting syllables, or even recognizing spoken words and sentences are all part of kind of the phonological awareness band. I should say that's not limited to English, but in the work that we're talking about, when we're doing explicit instruction, we're kind of transferring those skills for multilingual learners into kind of English phonemes or sounds that they maybe have transferred to, but maybe would be newer sounds in English. And then phonics refers to kind of the ability to know and apply the sounds and spelling patterns in order to decode words in print. So those are kind of critical skills that we're working on in the early literacy classroom. So in an example lesson, you might see a progression that looks something like this. This comes from a curriculum called CKLA, which is accessible online. So what I want to give you a moment to do is read the lesson on the screen. It's also linked in your handout. So if you'd like to reference it there and make it a little bigger, that's great. As you're skimming through that lesson, I'd love for you to think about this focus question that you see on the bottom. So what multisensory strategies are evident to you in this lesson, and how do they support student learning? So I'm going to give you a minute or two to kind of preview this lesson, think about that, and then as you're ready to, you can put responses to that focus question in the chat. Thoughts or responses you have to that focus question in the chat. What multisensory strategies do you see in this lesson, and how do they support student learning? Thanks, Rachel, for getting us started. Yeah, so we see references to the hand motions for when students are doing that blending work. Melanie talked about, we're giving kids kind of tactile and explicit instruction on the shape of the mouth when we form the sound, and using mirrors to kind of help them see that. Some scaffolding in the multisensory responses. Great. So these are things that we kind of thought about as well. We see a lot of opportunities, like y'all said, to use gestures, to use mirrors to really get visual for students. So combining the kinesthetic, the tactile with some visual support. Students are also in this lesson drawing while saying and hearing sound. So they're doing some auditory alongside visual and tactile. They're doing some writing. The tapping on the arm, like someone said, is a great way for students to really like feel the skill of blending a particular word or particular sounds and words. And so I want us to just keep that in mind that, like we talked about, many of these strategies have already been built into materials that you might be using. And the value comes in having students engage in this work. So Nicole referenced in the chat, these opportunities really allow lots of students to engage, particularly students who might not have a lot of confidence or who might be struggling with particular skills, or again, who might be multilingual learners who kind of are still kind of putting all these pieces together. And so the focus here is on students using and learning the sound to write the letter formation for that sound. Multisensory strategies are how they're engaging with that skill and how they're engaging with learning to do that skill. But that isn't the learning itself. So the hand motions aren't kind of the learning that they're doing. It's just a tool to help them engage in that work and to build some confidence or to build some motivation while kind of making those connections in their brain really strong. So even though you might have curriculum that really supports you to do this, I want to really emphasize that materials don't teach, teachers do. So if you do have materials that are kind of setting you up for this type of explicit instruction and with lots of multisensory strategies like the lesson we just looked at, the key for you is to really make sure that you're studying that lesson and you know what are the key points in this lesson, what is kind of the key idea in this section or in this routine that I'm trying to accomplish, and are there any multisensory strategies incorporated? Many of the high quality curriculums that you might be using have already done that for you, but if you haven't prepared those things ahead of time, like having the mirrors ready for students, it can be really challenging to kind of get those things ready in the moment. And so that might be something where you're kind of scrambling and kids maybe miss out on that engagement. If you don't have materials or if you don't have kind of a strong foundational skills curriculum that really sets you up to do this well, that's part of why we're showing you some of these strategies today so that you can just continue to be intentional about, in that blending work that you're doing, adding some tactile movement, or in the work where you're introducing a particular letter, maybe using the mirrors to help students really see how that sound is formed, and then using those things to help them see the sound before they write the sound. So we're providing some strategies today. The Project Arise course also has some recommendations for phonics and phonological awareness work that can include some next steps and some high quality kind of free online resources. But in either scenario, whether you have really strong materials or you're kind of working without strong materials, either way, preparation is really kind of the key, and being intentional with your strategies is really important.
Ruthie, and thank you. In the chat, Rachel has a question regarding students who are non-speaking or use some assisted devices.
Yeah, that, I think a couple things there. I think one, that would be an important opportunity because I don't know the individual characteristics or circumstances for all of those students that you might be working with. That would be a really important time to loop in service providers for those students. So speech language pathologists, occupational therapists in some cases, certainly the special education kind of support staff that might be working with those students will have really important ways that kind of everyone comes together to support that particular student with their individual needs and create some plans and kind of goals around that. So that's, I think, the most important thing, is to kind of loop in the particular support staff that's working with those students. In terms of non-speaking students or nonverbal students, many of these multisensory strategies are going to be helpful and important for them to work with too. So they might not be verbally kind of communicating their reading or writing skills in the same way that we would see other students communicate those things verbally. You might assess them with visual assessments or something like that, but engaging them with those same kind of tactile or visual supports will often be as effective or even sometimes more so to kind of engaging them and providing that support that they need. So that's kind of a quick answer. But I would really encourage for those individual circumstances, again, just looping in the support staff that's kind of setting goals for them and creating IEPs if they have them, things like that. Yeah, no problem. A couple other kind of quick strategies that you can absolutely go to. I forget now who said this in the chat, but someone said like the hand motions are just a great tactile strategy. I would really emphasize and double down on that. So for example, if you're working on segmenting phonemes, you might use fingers to have students hold up the finger for each phoneme that they hear and encourage students to do the same. So for example, with man, we might have and so on. I really will caution you with hand motions that you want to mimic the direction that students are reading right or left to right. And so that might take some practice of either using your right hand and starting left to right so that they're seeing that not backwards. Or I've even seen teachers like face the same way that students are and use their left hand, but they're counting so that students are seeing that left to right counting progression. It sounds like a very small detail, but especially for some kids who might be struggling, having that consistency with left to right directionality can really be important so that they're not getting confused about where to start with, you know, their own blending or decoding skills, and can just be important with that repetition and reinforcement of left to right always. The other kind of quick strategy that I'll share for supporting all learners with letter formation, if a student is consistently confusing similar letters such as B and D, I would really encourage kind of isolating and focusing on one letter for a couple of days or even maybe a little bit longer than that, and really reinforce and really get that one letter solid before kind of trying to introduce the second one. And so really making sure that we're also within that working on one letter and then introducing the second one, being very explicit in how to write each of those using the verbal path of the stroke. So, you know, to make a B, we first make the vertical line and then we add the circle. And then once you get to D, you might say, first we make the circle and then add the vertical line. So giving kids that verbal path to kind of always start that little chant can help them solidify visually kind of how to separate and distinguish those letters, as well as kind of give them an auditory and tactile way to distinguish them as well. So I'm going to give you a moment to just kind of take any notes that you want to with that phonological awareness and phonics section for early learners. And then we're going to move into some advanced decoding for upper elementary and secondary learners that might be helpful if you're working with a little bit older students. Decoding strategies. So for students that are a little bit older, upper elementary, certainly secondary, these are going to be extremely helpful and research aligned. One piece that we're going to talk about first is the study of language, which is referenced as morphology. And so this is really teaching students kind of how word parts or morphemes are combined to make words. So morphemes are the smallest unit of language that has meaning. So a frequent way that we kind of hear about morphemes are prefixes or suffixes. So that might be kind of a way for you to familiarize yourself with this idea of morphology. And so advanced decoding really gets at supporting students with multisyllabic words, anything beyond kind of basic letter sound correspondence that happens kind of in the early elementary realm. This is extremely important for developing fluency and for supporting students in building fluency beyond kind of that individual letter sound correspondence so that, like I said, they can read more complex words like multi-syllable words, or even advanced spellings with kind of vowel diphthongs or things like that. So in the early elementary years, students actually do learn about word endings such as S on the end of words or ing on the end of words. But as students begin to read more multisyllabic words, we want them to really get explicit instruction in more complex morphemes or smaller units that have meaning. And so morphology really helps us do that. This supports advanced word reading. It really helps students build vocabulary and ultimately increase their comprehension. So I'm going to show you an example of what this looks like with a quick video. This video comes from a series that shows examples from the IES practice guide, which I'll share in the chat a link to so that you can kind of see other examples. If you're not familiar with this practice guide, it's an incredible resource. It gives just great actionable tips. It gives a lot of information for supporting upper elementary and secondary students. And so this video comes from recommendation 3, which is build word and world knowledge. So I'm going to put that practice guide in the chat so that you have it. And then we'll play the video. As you watch the video, we're going to use that same focus question that we've been working through. What multisensory strategies are evident in the lesson and how do they support learning? Oh.
As we saw before, like using context sometimes doesn't always work, and so we need another strategy. Another strategy that we can use is looking for meaningful parts of the word. One way is we can look for prefixes. A prefix is a word part that comes before a base word and changes the meaning of the word.
Okay, give me 1 second. I'm going to try to at least, yeah, I'll include captions. I know it might be hard to hear. So hopefully the captions can kind of help put that together. And I'll go back a little bit.
Known or tricky words. And we talked about how we can use context to help us find out what that word means. But as we saw before, like using context sometimes doesn't always work, and so we need another strategy. Another strategy that we can use is looking for meaningful parts of the word. One way is we can look for prefixes. A prefix is a word part that comes before a base word and changes the meaning of the word. So what do you notice about this word? Do you see a base word? Able. And what is the prefix? Dis. It shares the same prefix. Dis means not. So if dis means not, what do you think if we put it together? Disable. What would this word mean? Not able, right? So these two words share the prefix dis, and both times means not. So this is a clue as to what that word means. So this is a picture of a car being disabled, right? What makes this car disabled? It's not running. It's not running properly. It's not working. It's not able to like move. It's not able to move, right? So we're going to continue thinking about how to use word parts to help us figure out what a word means. Just like we use prefixes and suffixes, we can also use Greek and Latin roots. So one root that is in a lot of English words is this root bio. This root bio means life. Can you say bio with me? Bio. Bio means life. So just like we saw with our prefix, anytime you see this root bio in a word, the word is going to have something to do with life. So when I add it to this other part that we've learned about, so we've learned about ology, and we know ology, that root means study of. So when I put these two parts together, bio means life, and ology means means the study of, I can use my knowledge of those two word parts to figure out what this word means. So it means the study of life, biology, the study of life. So open your markers. Remember, we create one circle in the middle of our board, and that's where we write our common word parts. Make sure that circle is big enough to write the word bio. And underneath the word bio, write what that root means. So then we can, remember, extend just one on the top, write that word biology that we talked about, which is the study of life. We can write the other word we talked about, biography, which is this, to write about someone's life. Now let's think. Do you know any other words that have the root bio?
All right. So thinking about what we saw in that video, go ahead and share in the chat, what were some multisensory strategies that you noticed, and how did they support, or how would they later on maybe support student learning? Yeah, so getting all students to engage, not just in like a call and response way, but to really have a discussion. So the picture support really helping kind of level the playing field for all students to engage in the discussion. So not just saying like, what do you think disabled could mean? And kind of having students maybe tap into some background knowledge, but using that picture to engage every student in the group to respond. Lots of saying things, writing things at the end, connecting those dots of like speaking and listening about biology, and then writing those things down. Great. So those might be some pieces that you could incorporate even with early elementary students, but certainly with upper elementary and secondary students, really intentionally and explicitly supporting them and understanding morphemes within words. So those smaller units of meaning. I think in general, like whiteboards can be a really helpful kind of quick way to get kids to write and certainly engage in some of those discussions, like we talked about using images. The other piece I wanted to point out is that idea of the word map. So helping kids kind of have a visual and even sort of a tactile way of connecting the different words that they're using. So disagree, disable, kind of using word maps to bring connection to those ideas. And students had lots of opportunities to hear and say each prefix. And you could think about, like, as this extends on, the more they get into that routine, she can probably push them to more independence with kind of reading those words on their own or generating those words with examples, things like that, or even generating the word map more independently. All right, so I'm going to give you a moment to kind of quickly think about, in that section about morphology, what kind of did you see that you want to apply to your own practice, or what was affirmed about that work that might be something you want to keep doing or do a little bit differently, maybe with specific students. Yeah, I love, if y'all haven't gotten a chance to see what Nicole shared in the chat, it's a great, I think, just reflection and reminder that a lot of this is about getting kids to take risks and to kind of build some confidence in just taking that risk so that they're able to do some of these things more independently. And oral engagement, especially with like visuals or pictures or things like that, can be one way to just break down some of the barriers for that. And that oral engagement can ultimately help them build the confidence when they're reading or they're writing to have that same kind of risk-taking like opportunity or kind of confidence to do it. All right, so we're going to get into some strategies to support fluency now. And I want to just give a quick, again, definition before we get into some of the strategies. So fluency refers to a reader's ability to read a text with a couple of dimensions of how we think about how they're reading that text. So we look at accuracy, we look at prosody, meaning the reading isn't like in a monotone voice. They're using phrasing, they're using expression. They're using, importantly, like phrasing that actually demonstrates that they're comprehending the passage or the text as they're reading. And then in terms of pace, it's not too fast, it's not too slow. There's kind of a Goldilocks pace there. So not speed reading. All three of these things kind of combined are ways that we can observe whether students are reading with fluency. And we can measure these things with things like words per minute and even having some prosody rubrics and things like that. And this is a really critical bridge between word recognition and comprehension. So fluency doesn't guarantee that students are comprehending something, but disfluency actually demonstrates there is a lack of comprehension happening somehow. So like I said, if they're not reading with meaningful phrasing, we're seeing some kind of breakdown with comprehension. Or if they're reading so fast or so inaccurately, there's some kind of breakdown in comprehension. So a couple of quick examples with fluency. We're going to watch another video, and we're going to think about within this fluency lesson, how do we see the teacher engage students in multisensory strategies? And in this particular kind of piece, I just want you to think about how does that then support student learning to build those fluent practices. So I will again turn on the captions just in case.
It's really important that you circle or underline any words, either don't know what they mean, or any words that you think might be tricky to say when I practice saying, okay? So we're going to listen first to how this beat reads the first two paragraphs on page 50. You're going to have to think where it says throughout. And I do need you watching the text so that you can start learning about the pacing and accuracy that we're going to use when we're using it, right? So this is going to start. Please all eyes on the text. So our eyes know where throughout the entire boxing career, my belief in my abilities triumphed over the skill of an opponent. My will was stronger than their skills. What I didn't know was that my will would be tested even more when I retired. In 1984, I was conclusively diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. Since that diagnosis, my symptoms have increased and my ability to speak in audible tones has diminished. If there was anything that would strike at the core of my confidence in myself, it would be this insidious. But my confidence and will to continue to live life as I choose won't be compromised. Raise your hand if there's any words that you either want to speak, kind of talk about what they mean, or words you want to hear again. All right. Any words that might stand out? We got a ticket to the first one to volunteer this morning, Kayla. Insidious. Insidious. So let's practice saying it. Insidious. Insidious. One more time. Insidious. Insidious. So insidious is something that kind of moves slowly, but it's still harmful. So like a disease that takes a long time to spread through your body, but it's still really harmful to you. Any other words that kind of stood out that might be tricky? Parkinson's disease. So Parkinson's disease affects your nervous system, and so it causes you to have kind of tremors, and also can affect your ability to speak. So we're going to say Parkinson's disease. One more time. Parkinson's disease. Parkinson's. All right. Any other words that kind of stood out? Right. Last word. Compromised. Say I'm listening for. The first is your accuracy, because again, there's a lot of complicated vocabulary in that second paragraph.
All right. So go ahead and share in the chat, what are ways that we notice this teacher set students up to do that fluency work with some multisensory strategies? And any thoughts on kind of how that supported student learning? Stephanie, I see your question about the link. I'm gonna, while y'all are sharing in the chat, work on dropping it in the chat for you. So go ahead and pop any thoughts in the chat. I'm going to try to find the link so I can share the direct link to the video. That the teacher is doing to engage students. Yeah, scaffolding vocabulary. So making sure before they read that we're not just emphasizing just accuracy or decoding skills. Like that is important, of course, but we also want students to be thinking about, do I understand what this passage actually means? That's the ultimate goal of reading. We want kids to make meaning of what they're reading. So if they don't understand insidious actually means something, it's important as they're reading that to kind of have that in their brain. What else are people thinking about? What did we notice that she did before students even read the text on their own? How did she support them? So one quick thing I'll stamp is she engaged students before they read it on their own to just listening to her read aloud the text so that they could hear, this is how it should sound when you're reading it. These are the punctuation pauses that I'm going to use. These are kind of ways that we can infuse expression or phrasing in this particular text that might be completely different than we use in a fiction text. So kids kind of had that audio experience before they learned. She also kind of prompted students, and this gets into the second way that you could support learners, in prompting them to track while she was reading. So this is something that can be really helpful even for secondary students, but also like even as an adult reader, there are some texts where I'm like, okay, I'm actually going to track with my finger while I'm reading this, so I'm paying closer attention. Tracking can be really helpful to just kind of increase like attention and also decrease a little bit of the cognitive load. The other piece is, again, sort of giving opportunities to pre-read, even if it's just a short section of an article or story with an adult, and get some feedback about that opportunity, and then get another opportunity for repeated reading. So this gets to what Nicole shared in the chat earlier. That can just be a great way to boost confidence and increase that risk-taking for students who might not want to participate in class-wide reading structures or opportunities to kind of read even with a partner. So giving them that pre-reading practice before they do it in their tier 1 class might be something that could be helpful. With our remaining time, I do want to get to some strategies that can support vocabulary. Stephanie, I promise I haven't forgotten your video link. I'm working on it. If we can't get it to y'all today, we'll make sure to share it in a follow-up email. But with vocabulary, we saw in the video some examples where she did some scaffolding where they underlined words that students might not understand. She had also clearly done some pre-thinking about those vocabulary words. So she was able to provide a quick definition of insidious so that they could understand what that word meant without doing like a whole tangent lesson on that vocabulary. Same thing with Parkinson's disease. She kind of had that prepared of like, here's how I can quickly explain this. The goal of this is fluency. It is not a lesson on Parkinson's disease. And so that is something I want us to keep in mind. We do want to be intentional with preparing, thinking about what vocabulary words students might need to unpack the text. But most vocabulary is learned through exposure and experience. And so we may have some words that we need to teach through direct or explicit instruction. We also may have lots of words that we can kind of indirectly support students in building vocabulary around through context or through kind of other experiences. And so an important part of your planning will be really thinking critically about which vocabulary words are essential to understanding this text or this passage or this sentence, and which of these do I need to directly, explicitly provide some instruction around. We won't have a lot of time today to get into the how of selecting vocabulary words, especially for multilingual learners or students with disabilities. They might need instruction in more vocabulary than is directly taught through the core curriculum. But we do have some resources linked in the handout, and so that will go into much more depth about vocabulary. But quickly, I'll just give an example of what this might look like in a classroom. So we saw in the video, she had students, find words that they didn't know or wanted her to define. We might also just go ahead and do that ahead of time for students. So in this text, there might be a sentence, the class stood in 2 parallel lines. And so as a teacher, I might have prepared and thought like, oh, parallel is something that is critical to understanding this particular sentence. And it's also a word that students will likely need to know in other contexts, like in math class. And so that could be something particularly helpful for multilingual learners, that if they have that understanding of the word parallel, they can generalize that word and use it across and transfer it across multiple settings. And so I might highlight that part of the text for students and then provide a quick student-friendly definition. So parallel is 2 straight lines in the same direction that are always the same distance apart, and they will never cross. And then I might show some images of pencils that are parallel or not parallel. And I would even extend this further into having students show, with their pencils, like hold it if it's show me a parallel pencil, show me not parallel pencils, and kind of get kids to engage in that way. Then they might test their partner and say like, are these parallel lines or are these not parallel lines? Something like that could be a quick, like maybe 2-minute vocabulary exercise where students are getting something that's critical to understanding this particular sentence, but they're also then getting something that's transferable and generalizable. And this particular word example, this is also really helpful because parallel is a cognate in English and Spanish. And so that can be a great support for multilingual learners. that might be part of your decision-making process, is where do I have opportunities for cognates and where do I have opportunities that we might be building something that isn't a cognate in Spanish, that I might need to build vocabulary around. So with that, I'm going to do one more kind of quick example, and then I'll give you some time to reflect on the fluency and the vocabulary work before we close out for today. So another kind of piece that I've been kind of referencing throughout this section is particularly for students with disabilities and multilingual learners, visuals and home language supports can be incredibly helpful for students to get additional practice, to get additional kind of connections and multisensory resources for the vocabulary work that they're doing. And so having opportunities for them to, with their vocabulary words, get a quick definition, but also an image of that. And like I said, using some Spanish and English cognates, if they exist, can really help solidify some of those connections and can also help kids transfer and generalize the different vocabulary work that they're doing. I want to just kind of emphasize this quote at the bottom of the screen. So English learners will benefit most from rich, intensive vocabulary instruction that emphasizes student-friendly definitions, that engages students in the meaningful use of word meanings in reading, writing, speaking, and listening, and that provides regular review of those particular vocabulary words. So thinking about this kind of brings together all the multisensory strategies that we've been talking about, but in particular for multilingual learners, these kind of 4 quadrants of working with vocabulary can be really helpful in accelerating their knowledge. And so I'm going to give you a quick moment to reflect on the fluency or vocabulary work, and then we'll do some closing. About vocabulary selection in the handout linked, but yes, we do have some other, and Melanie shared a great one in the chat as well, if you'd like to do some further reading about that. All right, we're a little bit over time, so I'm gonna kind of sum all of this up and close this out. So in summary, we've been talking all today about, although students benefit from multisensory instruction, the key idea is that we really want to be intentional and consider the purpose of those strategies. So, beware of fads that aren't actually supported by research. So like scented markers or, alphabet shaped cereal or something like that. Like there are lots of like Pinterest trends that can get in the way of just being intentional with really bringing together lots of ways that students are hearing, saying, reading, or writing different foundational skills that you're working on. And I also want you to keep in mind that more isn't always better. So sometimes less is more, and we want to be really intentional with what we're doing. So we might just do hand motions and be really intentional with that. And that might be way better than like adding 700 other kind of exciting or other things that we could use, but don't really need to. In terms of other kind of considerations that might be helpful, if you keep it consistent across different environments for students, that can be actually incredibly helpful for them to generalize. So if the general education teacher, the special education teacher, the speech and language pathologist are using consistent strategies. So this gets back to that question about nonverbal students. This is why I said really talk to providers for those students, because that's one way that you can really support them, is if all of those service providers are using consistent strategies, then that can really help them generalize. And as we've been talking all throughout today, students are really motivated when they feel successful, and they're successful when they're learning. And so we want to engage them as best as we can to kind of take those risks and build confidence in those foundational skills, so that they feel really motivated to try them independently. So a couple of things that are linked in your handouts that can extend your learning if you'd like to. And then in terms of next steps, I just want you to think about what might you start doing, stop doing, or adjust based on what we've talked through today. But most importantly, I hope you're leaving really affirmed that you're already doing many of those things. You might just need to kind of be intentional. And so considering one area that you might support students with multisensory instruction in a new way or kind of in a way that's a little bit adjusted might be a good way to take your learning from today. So with that, we'll do a quick survey, and then I know we're a little over time, but once you're done with that survey, you're free to go. So thank you so much for all of your engagement today and kind of sharing thoughts in the chat. And please let us know if we can help with anything else.